Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Who's the Most Neurotic Superhero panel. I am Danny Fingeroth. I was a writer and editor at Marvel Comics for many years. I wrote a book called Superman on the Couch, which, as you would imagine, is a psychological look at superheroes. I've most recently written a biography of Stan Lee called A Marvelous Life from St. Martin's Press, and did the audiobook as well. The paperback is out. And now I will let our panelists introduce themselves. So I'll start with Dr. Travis Langley.
I am Dr. Travis Langley, Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Henderson State University, best known as the author of the book Batman and Psychology, A Dark and Stormy Knight, which I originally wrote partly because I was reading Danny's book, Superman on the Couch, and thought I want to write this kind of book, but as a real psychologist. This panel itself started because Danny, once upon a time, made this wisecrack, hey, we should do a Who's the Most Neurotic Superhero panel. And I said, you know what? I like that idea. And here we are now.
I'm Dr. Leandra Parris. I'm a school psychologist at William and Mary, and I specialize in childhood trauma, trauma-informed care in school, and social justice and equitable services for youth. And I kind of know everyone mostly through Travis. I contributed to his Supernatural book, Joker, Black Panther, a few of the others, and done a few panels with people around supervillains. So super excited to join everyone and talk it out.
I'm JJ Sedelmeier. My wife Patrice and I have an animation studio that we recently celebrated our 30th year. We opened the studio to take print artists and translate them into animation, but over the course of just having a studio, we got involved with things like launching Beavis and Butthead for MTV and starting the cartoons on Saturday Night Live with Ambiguously Gay Duo and Ex-Presidents. We've done animation for The Daily Show and Colbert.
Arie Kaplan. This guy, my name's, I don't know, my hand is going backwards. I can't seem to point directly to my name. But I am a comic book writer and graphic novelist and an author, and also a screenwriter for television and video games and transmedia. Recently wrote 3 children's graphic novels under the Mythical Creatures series for a capstone. I wrote a little golden book about Loki, which people find very strange because they're only familiar with Loki as a character from the movies, and this is the Marvel version of Loki, but I found that even though this is a book for 5-year-olds, adults who have crushes on Tom Hiddleston seem to be buying it.
Do you have some neurotic credentials to bring to the table?
I am the screenwriter for a video game called EQ: The Next Generation Lodestars. It is an emotional fitness game. It helps people with emotional resilience and helps them to overcome anxiety, and it's out now from PsychApps.
Oh, holy cow.
I sign my work as Sikoryak. I'm a cartoonist and a freelance illustrator and animator. I do a lot of comics parodies and pastiche. My latest book is Constitution Illustrated, which is the complete text of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the amendments in the style of American comics from the past 120 years.
Very welcome. I wanted to ask the 2 actual psychologists. Neurotic is a term that's thrown around, usually not as a compliment. Does it have a diagnostic meaning, or is it something that's more of a layperson's usage?
It has become a layperson's word. It was a diagnostic term. It's a Freudian term, but it is not a modern diagnostic term technically, although there are plenty of professionals who use it themselves. How do you teach it, Leandra?
Whenever I do use it, it's usually around someone who has a lot of high energy anxiety and can't get through the next phase. So without doing something to attend to that. But we kind of dropped it. It's not in the DSM the way, so we just kind of dropped it from our use.
People who are neurotic are handling stress badly.
Yeah.
That's one of the simplest ways of putting it. Some people will kind of define it as comparing it to psychotic. Psychotic, you've lost touch with reality, and the neurotic is this catch-all for any other mental problem that did not involve actually losing touch with reality.
That's a pretty wide wide catch-all. Now I think I'm going to go into share screen. This was from a show from the 70s. That's Frank Gorshin as a therapist. Mm-hmm. And who's playing, I guess, Captain Marvel here?
That is Garrett Craig playing the original Captain Marvel, Shazam. while the Riddler pretends to be a therapist in Legends of the Superheroes.
Okay, so this is Captain Linger, of course, a creation of the J.J. Sedelmeier studio.
The Linger character, this is one of my favorite pieces because it just totally does a mind trip on you. It doesn't adhere to any of the convention that you're used to getting with comic books, with cartoons, with the superhero character. He would come to save, let's say, go to a wedding where there's an earthquake happening, but he's usurped by Type A man. There he is. And who does everything quick. He's on the ball. He knows what's going on. And Linger's just kind of not, doing it. And he spends the most of the cartoon explaining that guy, the most brilliant line I think that Stewart's ever written. Some of the other superheroes already don't like him. And it makes you squirm. We did about 7 or 8 of them all together, and they really show a character that you expect to behave a certain way, just not getting through the day well at all. It was great. It was really a great series to be a part of.
Yeah, its hallmark is how uncomfortable he makes everybody, including anybody watching the cartoon. He's actually, he seems to be as skilled and as superpowered as any of the other, but through, one might say, neuroses, he makes himself an annoyance. It's an elegant concept.
I love his body language in this shot. You never see a superhero quite like that.
Well, it's funny because usually, when the question is, how would real superheroes behave if they existed? And, the answer is usually something very dark, like Watchmen or The Boys. But this is the other side of that, of how would people who had superheroes really behave? Well, kind of like, like socially awkward, neurotic,
right,
people like us. Thanks, JJ. I'm going to move over to a few covers by our Sikoryak. Bob, what was the motivation behind Action Camus?
For a lot of my work, I will take literary classics, in this case, Camus' The Stranger, and combine them with famous comic book characters. So this just seemed like the most incongruous pairing I could think of at the time, where Camus is the disaffected anti-hero protagonist of The Stranger. One reason I like this connection, the sun is an important part of the story. The physical sun is an important part of the story in The Stranger, and I love the idea that Superman gets his power from the yellow sun, and the Stranger somehow has to grapple with the sun through the course of the novel. I think on some level I was also inspired by this pairing. I don't know if you have any other covers, but you'll sort of see his kind of inability to relate to people the way you'd hope certainly Superman would be able to.
Really brilliant stuff, though.
Thanks.
The running joke of this panel always is, sort of the spoiler alert. Who's the most neurotic superhero? Well, it's always going to be Spider. You can make a case for others, but maybe because I worked as a writer and editor of Spider-Man for so long. This is probably the first vision of this character who mixes joy and sorrow and obsessiveness with carelessness. This is from the modern superhero origin. It's Peter Parker. He gets bitten by the spider, goes into show business to make money, and then while he's being an arrogant TV star, his uncle is killed by a burglar that he could have stopped. So he thinks. I mean, that's, we can talk about that, whether Peter really did anything wrong. But this is where, by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko from Amazing Fantasy 15, this is really the, among the cornerstones of the so-called Marvel Revolution, and where we get my fault, all my fault. Now Uncle Ben is dead, and a lean, silent figure slowly fades into the gathering darkness, aware at last that in this world, with great power, there must also come great responsibility and great neuroses, it would seem. You can see people. That's Peter Parker in the foreground. In the background are typical New Yorkers What would make a guy wear a goofy costume and run around chasing crooks? I don't know. He must be a neurotic of some sort. The pattern was set. He's just saved the day, much like Captain Linger, or maybe much like Type A Man. Is this my fate? Am I destined to go through life as a professional fall guy? Why must I be a costume, superpowered sad sack? Especially when the Torch, who's no better than I in any respect, gets all the glory, the praise. And even the girl, for him, life is one big happy ending. It's very human, it's very classic Marvel, and it's kind of, I guess, low-level neuroses we go through. Right, once again, he's beaten whatever the villain of the issue is. Can they be right? Am I really some sort of a crackpot? Why don't things ever seem to turn out right for me? Why do I seem to hurt people, no matter how I try not to? Is this the price I must always pay for being Spider-Man? And so we take our leave, and here's Stan speaking. I think these, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, I think had their own understanding of neuroses and conflict, and we take our leave of the world's most human, most misunderstood superhero. But if you think his life is complicated now, wait till you see the hand that a capricious fate deals him next issue. Later on in the John Romita years, Peter is contemplating quitting being Spider-Man. All he hears is menace, egomaniac, public enemy, fraud, mentally disturbed. Perhaps only a madman would do what I do, taking the risks, accepting the dangers. And then this is our more modern Spider-Man, played by Tom Holland, who plays him more like an insecure teenager. And then maybe the most recent mainstream Spider-Man, the thing Into the Spider-Verse, we have on the right the guy who's supposed to be sort of the, basically supposed to be Peter Parker, kind of going to seed. And see here, he's got a little bit of an issue with food and burying his emotions and his problems with eating. So, anybody have any thoughts on Spidey and how he's come to represent our main neurotic character?
I think part of it is that he's the first well-known one whose motivation to be a superhero is itself neurotic. He is driven by guilt and angst. Batman and Daredevil, they were motivated to avenge their dead parents, but even that is more active than guilt and angst. For the most part, your classic superheroes were just good people who either happened to get superpowers or decided to get superpowers. It was like, well, we got these, we might as well do something good now. I look like an orange Rocky monster, but Reed, let's do something good with these powers. I built an iron suit, I'll do something good with them, even though I'm kind of a jerk. Doctor Strange had some of his guilt over his past ego having caused us problems, but he was not that level of well-known that Spider-Man was. Spider-Man was incredibly popular because he was relatable, he was young.
It's interesting because the early 60s being so different from the late 30s, it's the superheroes hid their neuroses, their psychological problems behind their whole secret identity thing. That's where it all seemed to dwell. What part of the personality was able to shine, when you're in costume, and what are you hiding is the mild-mannered supposedly everyday guy, both with Superman and Batman. There's no way that time period could handle what was being done by Marvel in the early 60s. But there was that, I just keep thinking of that whole, that shot of Bruce Wayne when he sees the bat and the whole Omen thing and everything. It's, there's a lot of turmoil going on there that's really, really, and beautifully staged in that drawing. Just really great stuff.
But then he always has this confidence that Peter Parker does not have. Yeah. I think that's part of what, when we think the word neurotic these days, when you think of something like Woody Allen movies, you are thinking of a character who is not confident. And so I think that also, even though that's not a defining quality of it, but that is very much our conception of neurotic. I think that's another reason Peter Parker epitomizes it so well.
And yet what Peter Parker, Clark Kent, and the archetypal Woody Allen character all have in common is that they always win, right? They always beat their adversaries, get the girl, but in their own mind, they've lost. But right, and there's an aspect of Spider-Man that does allow him sometimes to have some pleasure from it. He plays tricks on people. He's
cocky as hell when he's in this costume.
Yeah.
That's a coping mechanism.
That's a self-defense.
But I would add something to that though, because that is such an inherent part of his personality, that he's joking and making jokes and everything. But what I find so interesting about it, it's very much crystallized in that one panel that you're showing right now, Danny, with the "my fault, all my fault," is that this is really, sort of building on what JJ and Travis have been saying. In a lot of ways, to just look at the character and the way the costume and everything and the motif of the spider is very much a descendant of these pulp heroes from the 30s, much in the same way that Superman and Batman and those kinds of heroes are. But when you establish that he is, as JJ was saying, a character whose motivation is guilt, then you just kind of have to, at a certain point, write him as this character. Like, that's such a good jumping off point for writing him as this character who's kind of like always ruminating and worrying and obsessing, and that just automatically became such a big part of his personality in the comics. And you see Stan Lee like building on that and making that a big part of Spider-Man's brand, and it really does set him apart. And it's something that you would just never see any of these pulp characters like the Shadow or Doc Savage doing. It makes him kind of like this new wave superhero for the 60s, much in a way that, again, a lot of his predecessors just weren't.
I feel like he's always going back to what Travis was saying, that second guessing. Like, everything's never good enough. It's always, I could have done something different. It's always shaped in this sort of blame that I don't see in other superhero characters as much. There are some. But I also feel like with Spider-Man, the reason he comes to my mind first is because if you strip away the superhero identity for other people, that neuroticism can kind of go away, right? Like if Bruce Wayne had never lost his parents and just went on to be a rich boy, like that would have been that, right? But like I think with Peter Parker, that was there before he got bit by the spider. Like he was an anxious kid to begin with, and like some of it is teenage angst, but like I'm telling you, that was way more than what I would normally see at a kid his age. So part of it is that I think his neuroticism was already a little bit there that got exacerbated by his identity, as opposed to his identity kind of leading towards that, right? And, I always have this thing I remember being taught about social skills and neuroticism, and we talk about the normal curve, right? And the lower end is sort of that lower cognitive intelligence and higher end being higher. And I remember my professor saying that someone who's high on the normal curve socially looks no different than someone who's low. And I feel like this is a good example of being so intelligent and thinking through everything so critically and going through every single piece that you create a loop that you can't get out of. And so Peter Parker's constantly never stopping. And yeah, he's funny. He's really funny. And I like that about him. But it is, I think Travis is right, a coping mechanism for all of the self-degrading conversations he's having in his head.
Here is, of course, J. Jonah Jameson, the publisher of the Daily Bugle. And so we get to this famous thing where Jameson has a moment of psychological insight so important that the words take up more of the panel than the than the actual artwork. Spider-Man represents everything I'm not. He's brave, powerful, and unselfish. The truth is, I envy him. I, J. Jonah Jameson, millionaire, man of the world, civic leader. I'd give everything I own to be the man that he is, but I can never climb to his level. So all that remains for me is to try to tear him down because, heaven help me, I'm jealous of him. So where does this fall in the neurotic spectrum?
Very.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he's driven by envy, which means he's driven by his own insecurities. A secure person does not feel the need to tear somebody down just because they have something cool that individual does not.
I think maybe we can move on. As we know, Iron Man, Tony Stark, starting in the comics in the 70s, so I guess it was hinted at since Stark was always a quote-unquote playboy, and has this, he's an alcoholic. Where does alcoholism fit on the DSM definition? Is it neuroses? Is it something more serious?
We usually talk about more of as a disorder, like a medical disorder. You know, it's an addiction, it's a chemical dependency, so your body is a little bit more present in that. But the neuroses is what leads to it typically. Anxiety, high anxiety is the number one path. All that pressure that we talked about with Peter Parker.
Right.
So I tend to put substance abuse as it's more that medical side of it. Like your body's physically dependent on this, and it literally will react if you take it away.
Yeah, in terms of those who originally used the term neurotic, like the Freudians and so forth, they'd have been less focused on the medical side than we tend to be these days. And they'd have seen that as a completely neurotic, terrible. They would see it as coming out of an attempt to manage your own stresses, but in a very wrong way. A whole lot of our behaviors come out of attempts to engage in defense mechanisms, attempts to cope. Some are much healthier than others, and this would be on the very unhealthy end of that. So therefore, very neurotic.
And is it treated with Stark? Is it treated as a biological thing, or more of some kind of a psychological development from his youth? How do they look at it usually?
I always wrote it as psychological.
Yeah.
The original David Michelini story, it gets worse and worse, but then he gets over it in one issue. And then later on, Denny O'Neil, who talked very openly about his own alcoholism in his history, he revisited it. He said that was too easy. And he's the one who had Tony really get to the depths. And get to the point of by morning Tony Stark will be sober or dead, and he is the one who. But even with Denny, he still wasn't looking at it so much from a medical sense, but as the psychological aspect. I don't remember writers really getting into talking about medical aspects of alcoholism along the way.
Yeah, I don't remember like the withdrawal piece at all, which would be. I think you're absolutely right. It was completely psychological. Just one day made up his mind, which is not how that goes usually.
And also, of course, that these characters are mostly defined by keeping secrets that they can't reveal to anybody. Mm-hmm. That would make, I think, therapy in general and group therapy in particular a little difficult. This is Captain America from one of his earliest appearances, and this is Cap displaying his survivor's guilt, which was a big part of the character. It was also in that era. It was sort of Superman displayed survivor's guilt. Even though for his first 20 years, Superman never really seemed to be bothered by the fact that he was the last survivor of an exploded planet. Sort of as the 50s and 60s, as psychology became more popularized, Superman had that, and certainly Captain America, who lost his partner Bucky, and Rick Jones says, "Look, I found this. Isn't this the outfit your ex-partner Bucky used to wear? Your ex-partner. Nice of you not to say your dead partner, but your ex-partner Bucky." Makes it sound like Bucky went off because like he got a girlfriend or something. No, he's dead. Look how it fits me. Anyone would think I'm your partner. Take it off. I never told you to wear it. I said take it off. Don't ever call yourself my partner again. I lost my partner, and I'll never forgive myself for letting it happen. And I'll never let it happen again.
But what I think is so great is that the way that they reintroduce Cap in the 60s is like he's thought out, right? He's the capsicle and everything, and he's thawed out from the ice. And then immediately he sits bolt upright. He's like, Bucky, because to him, the last thing he remembers is going down in flames off that flaming airplane with Bucky, and Bucky dying. And so that's the way he wakes up. And I was just rereading that story the other day, and aside from the fact that there's an alien that looks like a piece of broccoli in the comic, aside from that, the stuff with Cap waking up works really well on a dramatic level, I think. It holds up pretty well.
Here, Cap and Bucky in the movies, and of course Bucky, it turns out, spoiler alert for a 10-year-old movie, survived and was brainwashed and trained by the Soviets to become the programmed killer, the Winter Soldier, which added a whole other level of complexity to that relationship. This is Ben Grimm, the Thing, from the Fantastic Four, of course, and started out very disturbed about becoming a monster. How? Well, the three you beat your gums, the whole country is hunting for us, as though we're four monsters, or maybe they're right. Maybe I am a monster. I look like one, sometimes I feel like one. Within a year or two, he was like, he seemed to have, at least outwardly, become reconciled to the way he looked and clowning around with it. Any thoughts on Ben Grimm and his kind of burdens, real and perceived?
Well,
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, I was just going to say, I think part of the reason that he, correct me if I'm wrong, Danny, because you were at Marvel for quite a long time, but like, I always read it as the reason that he became so, he was never completely okay with looking like that, looking like a bunch of orange flower pot fragments, but he was sort of okay with it was because the Fantastic Four very quickly became these sort of celebrity superheroes in-universe within the Marvel universe. They're able to say, okay, I'm a public figure, the public knows me as looking like this, that's the extent to which I'm okay with this, and sort of have a sense of humor about it. Again, as kind of like a defense mechanism, though, because he really does, there's a lot of self-loathing with that character still.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. But I think maybe early on they went from the full time, they went from being like a tragic character who made the occasional wisecrack to a wisecracking character who had the initial glimpse of tragedy. I think maybe they just felt it'd be too depressing to show him, after maybe the first year, being constantly morose about it.
I think so, but it is always under the surface. I've noticed that like this character hates himself. No?
It's always there, even when he gets past that early shock of having become this monster. It's always there with him. He's just not talking about it as much as he did when it was new to him. He's kind of the original neurotic superhero, because the Fantastic Four, that's when Stan and company started writing the stories differently, bringing in everyday life issues like paying bills, but also the personal qualities, the insecurities, the neuroses. And out of that bunch of the Fantastic Four, well, he's the one who was carried a whole lot of anger over his status and insecurity over himself to see if this Beatles wig will work.
Well, the dark side of being special,
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, I mean, look, I want to know everyone else's takes on this, but I honestly, when you reread that first Fantastic Four story, it does not, I'm not saying it's not a superhero story. I'm not one of those people who thinks that, because they're not wearing tights and don't have code names, it doesn't make them superheroes. I think they definitely are, still count as superheroes. But I don't know whether they were originally envisioned as, let's say, a superhero group or sort of a Challengers of the Unknown type kids adventure series, or some genre mashup of the two. So could it be the kind of the sort of emotional complexity that you see even in the early Ben Grimm stories in the Fantastic Four, that's sort of a byproduct of the fact that it kind of wasn't like he's sort of like either a genre mashup or not quite a superhero story series yet?
Bob, you worked on that satire homage called Unstable Molecules.
Right.
They address any of that stuff in that
I
book?
actually have that. Yeah, that actually was written by James Sturm,
Uh-huh.
and I drew a pastiche within this story. But this is a fairly reverent story about them before they got their powers, and they have a lot of problems. There's a lot. The dynamics between the four characters are very fraught, I guess you'd say. But what I would say about the Fantastic Four is like Reed seems to carry a lot of guilt for making Ben into a monster. Like that is another part where I feel like a lot of the stories I remember reading where we have to change him back. I have to fix this for Ben.
Well, I mean, this is a guy who was so arrogant and called himself Mr. Fantastic that he decided to go up on an experimental space flight with his fiancée,
some reason.
Yeah, her kid brother.
For some reason.
And his best friend from college, who at least had some flight training as a test pilot, but even,
Yeah.
with no actual astronaut training, it decided, let's just do that, And is it neurotic, that kind of arrogance? What would you call that as a psychological trait?
That would be, especially those who see that built on a foundation of insecurity. It's like, why in the world would Reed go to some of those lengths? Yes, there is being full of himself, but there's also the strange need. The person who is truly in love with himself doesn't worry the same way about proving himself. Reed had this great need to prove himself.
Moving on, this guy maybe might be a tie with Spider-Man for most neurotic.
He's more confident.
He's, I think, too confident to tie with Spider-Man. He doesn't quite have that self-doubt, but very close.
Does Bruce Wayne ever blame himself for that loss in any of the versions?
Yeah, not to the level of Peter Parker, because it's illogical to think you could have done something as a kid, but some part of him becoming Batman has to do with having mentally replayed, what could I have done? I mean, there are some writers who've introduced more overt guilt. Jeff Loeb was the one who had Bruce say, "Hey, Mom, why don't you wear those pearls tonight?" Oh, good grief. I think that is unnecessary. I honestly think it's best that it is illogical. It is childhood illogical. What if I could have done something else? I think that is the most human level of guilt there. Throwing in something like what they cut from Batman Forever was the part of Dad's diary said, "Well, Martha and I want to stay home, but Bruce wants to go to the movies." I am really glad that got cut. I don't think those things need to be added to the story. Generally, his survivor guilt is not based on logic. It's just based the sheer emotion of stuff that started when he was 8 or however old they wrote him. He definitely has survivor guilt, and he has played that out many times. He wanted to become the person who could have stopped it.
Isn't the first Batman origin story 2 pages long? It's 16 panels.
It's pretty short.
9 panels.
And you kind of don't need more than that. You bring enough to it. There's one panel of his parents getting shot. It's I think that's enough.
Yeah, I don't think you need. And I also feel like with Batman 2, it was always more about the justice aspect, the lack of accountability for what happened, the crime that led to that, the fact that the person wasn't really held responsible, particularly with the Nolan version around it. Whereas Superman or Spider-Man, it's I am holding myself accountable. So I always feel like there's a little bit of a difference there about tackling the justice system versus relieving my own guilt about something I see as a direct result of my action. So a little bit of a different swing.
Spider-Man caught the burglar within that first story, and he still feels that powerful guilt. Whereas with Batman, the criminal did not get caught for a while, and part of the reason, it was an editorial decision too on them having the criminal get caught, because they wanted Batman to kind of let that go and be lighter than he had been. And they says that, well, we've got to get that out of the way. So he's not motivated by his parents' murder. It's almost kind of like what happened in Batman. There was a Schumacher movie because the second Schumacher movie, that's the one where we just don't get the parents' death referred to at all. That's not what motivates Batman anymore.
But although in the comics, I think that was wasn't that one of the many innovations that Bill Finger contributed to the comic, was that by doing that, by having Batman be motivated by his parents' death, I think this is I don't know if it's the first example of this, but certainly one of the first examples of a superhero whose motive was not basic altruism. It wasn't just, I'm doing the right thing just to do the right thing. It's this it has a lot of innate psychological depth to it that he's trying to he keeps grappling with his parents' murder, and that's the reason that he does this.
Well, there were others who had crimes to solve within their origins, but they usually have them solved in that first story, and then just kept doing good stuff.
And the mission always is not just to get revenge for this one bad thing that happened to me, but to make sure as much as I can that this type of thing doesn't happen to anybody else.
Which I think that as readers and as a population that's increasingly cynical and everything, I think we buy that more than we buy certain other characters that just do the right thing just to do it.
So this is, this is just a story that shows how resistant Bruce Wayne is to any psychoanalysis. And of course, here's the Joker and Harley Quinn
Guilt is just a trait quality for him. Guilt is ingrained in his soul. That's more an innovation by some later writers than it had been in the 60s. Frank Miller had a lot to do with, no, Daredevil needs to be defined by Catholic guilt.
And here, the Kingpin, his villain, kind of plays right into that. And, in this storyline, what's come to be called Born Again, takes everything away from him and so plays on his neuroses and his guilt. And we see the story of Matt Murdock descending so far as to even be hallucinating this phone conversation, but we see the character build himself back up. Kind of another riff on that was in one of the Netflix shows was Jessica Jones, who's got a even worse alcohol problem than Tony.
I always think about her when we bring up neuroticism, and it's like the PTSD with the anxiety and everything else, and then you have the drinking. So yeah, she's always high up on my list.
She's very self-destructive.
Yeah,
it's not something we're accustomed to seeing with the superheroic characters. Somebody who is that self-destructive throughout just about any area of her life. She gets healthier, especially in the comics.
And Deadpool, is he beyond? He's just nuts, Deadpool. Isn't that sort of his? Or am I being too flip here?
He's a bit outside the real psychology. He's a fantasy character, but I wonder, what did that teddy bear do?
Right. And then, of course, the Hulk has actually an ongoing supporting character named Doc Samson, who at various points has, tried to delve into the psychology of the Hulk and Bruce Banner. Just lie back, breathe deeply. Hulk knows how to breathe.
And he's the one who was talking to the superheroes in the X Factor story that I was talking about. Because he does become a superhuman himself.
Oh, yes.
They can more easily relate to him and talk to him about things they would have trouble with somebody else.
I think he's always anxious about his anger, which I think is top level neuroticism. Like, I'm anxious about my anger. Like, having fear of your own other emotion is another, like a whole other level, which is what makes him so interesting.
And the Hulk is like a actual physical embodiment of that.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Strange started out sort of the opposite of Peter Parker in that he was overly confident. Then, of course, his arrogance led to his downfall and rebuilding as Dr. Strange. Legion was an X-Men or a character who what was he ever diagnosed as?
Schizophrenia, right?
He's been diagnosed as schizophrenic. He's been diagnosed. Originally they used the word autistic, but when it was poorly understood later on, they realized no, that didn't fit him at all. And the psychotic has been used with him a number of times because of the way he can be detached from reality. Because he's also got levels of chaos in his head that most real people don't have, like things psychically picked up from other humans. But it can feel like that if you're schizophrenic.
So this is way beyond neurotic, though. Now, sort of here in one of our family substitutes, we have the Guardians of the Galaxy. And they're kind of all about dysfunctional family, with this being the most, I guess maybe the most classically Marvel kind of thing, where Star-Lord's father is Ego, the living planet.
It's hard to live up to a planet.
A dad so full of himself, he's called Ego. And well, of course, he's the ultimate deadbeat dad.
In his own world.
Also interesting how much of a running theme that is, particularly in the Marvel movies and the MCU films, is just father-son, like kids who have these incredibly flawed fathers specifically. Like, it's T'Challa, it's Thor, it's Tony Stark, it's Star-Lord, so you see it as a recurring theme. I'm sure it's very, very much on purpose.
Well, it's a classic part of the hero's journey. Reconciliation with the father is one specific part of that classic complicated trope. Reconciliation with the mother is not. And we can go into a whole other discussion on why.
And of course, reconciliation becomes even harder since so many of these origins are about the death of the father and or mother.
Yep.
So how do you reconcile with a ghost? This is the main Marvel thing that's out there, the main superhero thing that's out. It's WandaVision, based on a number of comics, and here she's unleashed Now, this is, for those who've read the comics, they know this is a common usage, dare I say, misogynistic usage of the Scarlet Witch as a magical character who loses control of her powers and always uses it to alter reality for everyone else, and in an often malevolent way.
Within the TV series, it represents the highlights, the most interesting parts throughout the comic book show. So talking about the series, we get to hit those. She is trying to escape from reality. She very, very blatantly early on, she's in a lot of denial, trying not to think about the worst. She's not actually psychotic. She does have reality there. She's trying really hard not to think about it, and at times she has to. Later on, she will talk more about it, and then she's depressed right after. She's finally thinking about what the reality is. Well, they all have repeated losses and tragedies, but if you want to look at her just in and of herself, we are talking about somebody with an extreme grief reaction and the ability to alter reality.
Right.
She in the films, she has over a pretty short time lost her parents, her twin brother, and the Vision. In the comics, when she had her first big break, she had essentially just lost the Vision and her kids. And so we are talking about repeated losses, and these wear on people. Even if you've managed to hold it together through some, you reach a breaking point, and that is very common and very human.
Definitely, that complex trauma piece is something that you see kind of come up for other characters, though, or like Death in the Family for DC, right? Where like people kind of handle it differently. And I think the thing that always made me uncomfortable about Scarlet Witch and the way it was in House of M was like the touch of hysteria, that the hysteric disorder that people kind of bring in, that would kind of come in, that was extremely sexist and misogynist. But at the root of it with the show, what I like what they've done is it really is going back to that blame and guilt. And I don't know how to answer your question about reality versus psychotic versus neurotic, because what's reality if you can create your own? Like, that is reality, right?
Well, isn't that sort of, and again, I'm speaking from a layman's perspective, isn't that insanity when you mistake, the reality in your head for consensus reality?
When it's a mistake,
she knows.
Yes. When it's a mistake,
yeah. But she knows. And if you're aware that your reality is different and you're aware of what reality actually is, I don't know, there's a line. And she's aware.
Do you think she is aware, or do you think she's deluded herself, at least in the show?
On the show, she seems to be aware. She's been in denial, but then she is fully capable of talking about it with whatever her brother is. Because
it seems very clear that she's aware up to a certain point. It's not entirely clear what Wanda knows and doesn't know.
The lack of memory that you bring up, that's an interesting issue when we get to talking about what's psychotic and what's not. Because you could have a blank period in your memory for a reason that's not psychotic at all, just the brain hasn't stored it, or it's been blocked away, or you just forgot. And the Freudian view is that all kinds of things are repressed and neurotic. If it's when you get to adding other things and distorting them that they start calling it psychotic. So she doesn't have an imaginary version that she came up with for what happened early on. She just doesn't know.
So I want to ask JJ and R. In a way, these shows are almost eating your lunch. I mean, a lot of what you do has. If what you guys do as satirists is say, well, what would happen if this kind of hodgepodge of real life psychological issues combined with the fantasy world of superheroes? Well, they're doing it, But I mean,
totally, Danny. As soon as I heard about this show, I was just like, wow, this is what you can do with a budget as opposed to one person making a comic. I mean, before it had been on the air, I just saw some photos. I was like, well, that a team of people can really make sense. A team of people can create a reality, is what it turns out.
Mm-hmm. So do you feel it's a challenge? Like, well, what's the next level of satire I can go to now?
In a way, sure. I mean, they have their own goals. I have different goals, but
right.
Certainly, I mean, I'm eyeing them. I'm eyeing them as they're going, for sure.
I think it's great that we're at a point where we can use that and start playing with, icons and characters that, were always held sacred. It's just great to tear the thing apart and play with stuff. And they took a major step with this. So it's, even getting down to the whole titles and everything, it's just wild, really wild.
So thank you, everybody, for this great talk. We could go on for another few hours, but I hear there are other panels at WonderCon this year. Well, what do you got coming up?
Yeah, so I wrote 3 of the titles in the Mythical Creatures series that's out right now for Capstone. There's 6 titles in total. I wrote half of them. They are Frankie and the Dragon, The Troll Under Puzzlefoot Bridge, and Trevor the Very Best Giant. Little Golden Book, the Loki Little Golden Book, which was also a lot of fun. And anyone with a sibling can relate to it, I think. And it's obviously the Marvel versions of Loki and Thor in the story. It's really fun because it's a bit of a challenge making a children's book for 5-year-olds where a supervillain is the protagonist. But, it's fun telling the story where he thinks he's the hero of the story. ArieKaplan.com. Going to be announcing some other recent projects soon on the website.
Yes, this is my latest book. In the tradition of adapting literary classics, I've adapted the Constitution and the amendments as a comic, and each page is in a different style, as you can see here. This is the first one, I guess, most appropriate for this panel today. Article 1, Section 1 begins with Superman and the Flash as the two houses of the Congress.
Doing a show at the New York Historical Society on the history of New York animation.
Wow.
We've amassed not only a lot of material like drawings and photographs, but also a lot of old animation equipment going back to the teens. And so, and they were very gung-ho about it, wanted to give it the ground floor. I'm hoping that resurrects. If not, I'll take it someplace else. I'm also working on a book with some friends in Evanston, Illinois, about Arthur Gerber, who was the architect who designed all of the rapid transit stations in Chicago.
Wow.
And so other than just, still cranking away at doing animated spots and so forth, there's a lot of fun stuff going on. And you can find me all over Facebook. I have like 3 different Facebook groups that I helm. So one on history of animation, one on the studio, and then my personal one. So keeping busy with fun stuff.
Thank you.
There's that Batman book that it's what I'm best known for is having written Batman and Psychology, A Dark and Stormy Knight, and then I'm editor and lead writer on 12 other books, the most recent of which, The Joker Psychology, Evil Clowns, and the Women Who Love Them. I wrote about 2/3 of it, but other fine people such as Leandra have contributed to these more recent books as well.
I do a podcast with Dark Loop Productions, so you can check us out at Dark Loops on YouTube channel. You can follow us on Twitter. We've done a variety of shows. I think the best one we did was probably Lovecraft Country, but we're plugging through Snowpiercer right now because why not? And then in April, we'll actually be doing a ReggieCon, and so I will be a guest panelist with Chris Claremont, and we'll be talking about diversity in the world of X-Men. And so if you have a chance to check out ReggieCon, it's hosted by Illinois State University. That's April 15th, and it's going to be a really great event. We're going to have some great conversations about diversity in the world of comics.
Thank you. And this is my pluggy moment here. So Superman on the Couch was the book that started me on this oddball superheroes and psychology path. My latest book is A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee from St. Martin's Press. The paperback came out recently. I did the audiobook. That is, a look at Stan's life that I think is pretty objective and straightforward from someone who comes from the comic book industry. Mike Manley and I will be doing a new Dark Hawk story. If you remember Dark Hawk from the 90s, Mike and I have reteamed for a story that will be coming out in April, I believe. So that is what's going on. And now we're back to our original image. I want to thank everybody, all these great panelists. I want to thank Travis for doing both being a panelist and for working the tech. So thanks everybody. Stay well, and we will see you in the funny papers and in the therapist's office. Okay.
Take it easy, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you
guys.
so much.
Thank you guys.
Excelsior.
Thank you. Stay well.
Bye.
Bye.